We're diving into the core of what shapes the philosophies of religious leaders, an examination that stretches across cultures, times, and beliefs, yet finds common ground in humanity's search for meaning, purpose, and guidance. And understanding these philosophies goes beyond learning doctrines or teachings. It involves exploring how these leaders understood life itself, how they approached the most profound questions of existence, and how they influenced not just spiritual thought, but also the ethical frameworks that govern societies. Let's start by acknowledging that every religious leader, from Jesus Christ to the Dalai Lama, did not just offer spiritual guidance, but a worldview, a way of interpreting the universe and our place within it. So these leaders weren't merely reacting to the problems of their time, they were addressing universal questions about existence. So what are we doing here? What is the purpose of life? What does it mean to live ethically in a world full of warring, conflict, and uncertainty?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Consider Jesus Christ, whose philosophy centered on love, compassion, and forgiveness. His teachings were radical for their time because they went against the grain of what power and authority meant in the ancient world. In a society governed by the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, Jesus taught his followers to turn the other cheek, to forgive not 7 times, but 70 times 7. This isn't just a religious message, it's a philosophical challenge to the way we think about justice, mercy, and human dignity. If we were to live by this philosophy, what would society look like? Can love and forgiveness truly be stronger forces than fear and punishment? Then we have figures like the Buddha, whose philosophy revolved around understanding suffering and its causes. The Buddha taught that life is suffering, but not in a pessimistic sense. He meant that suffering comes from our attachments, our desires, and our illusions about the nature of reality. By following the Noble Eightfold Path, individuals could reach enlightenment and free themselves from suffering. The Buddha wasn't just providing religious practices, he was offering a method for achieving a deeper understanding of life, for seeing through the illusions that bind us to cycles of pain and disappointment. There's a fundamental connection between these philosophies. Both Jesus and the Buddha were interested in transforming how people saw themselves and their place in the world. They weren't concerned with external power or material success. Their focus was internal, on the mind, the heart, and the soul. They believed that real change comes from within, and that's what makes their teaching so enduring. But here's the question we have to ask ourselves: how often do we actually look inward for solutions, rather than looking to change the external world around us? Let's move to other influential leaders like Confucius. His philosophy was deeply rooted in ethics, particularly how to create a harmonious society. Confucius emphasized the importance of relationships and social roles, arguing that moral integrity starts with knowing your place within a family, a community, and a nation. For Confucius, ethics wasn't an abstract concept, it was something lived out daily in how we respect our parents, our elders, our rulers. He believed that if everyone played their role well, society would naturally flourish. But here's where we're pushed to think: is personal moral behavior enough to guarantee a just society? Or does there need to be something more: laws, structures, or perhaps even revolution? This leads us to religious leaders who became revolutionaries in their own right, like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. Both men took their spiritual beliefs and applied them to the political realm, challenging systems of injustice with the power of nonviolence. Gandhi's philosophy of ahimsa, or nonviolence, wasn't just a tactic for political struggle, it was a way of life, rooted in Hinduism, that called for absolute respect for all living beings. Similarly, King's commitment to nonviolence was born from his Christian faith and his belief in the transformative power of love. Both leaders asked us to look at violence, hatred, and oppression not as inevitable forces, but as things that can be overcome by the moral strength of nonviolent resistance. Can nonviolence really overcome the most deeply entrenched systems of power? History suggests that it can, but only when enough people are willing to live by these philosophies, even at great personal cost. Malcolm X offers another perspective within this spectrum. His early philosophy focused on self-empowerment and defense against oppression by any means necessary. For Malcolm, who grew up in a society that dehumanized African Americans, the philosophy of nonviolence seemed too passive, too slow. He argued for a more forceful response to injustice, and while his views evolved after his pilgrimage to Mecca, his philosophy still resonates with those who feel that the system is stacked too heavily against them to rely on peaceful protest alone. These differences in approach, whether to respond to injustice with nonviolence or with force, reflect a deeper question about human nature. Are people inherently good, as many religious philosophies suggest, or is the world a place where power must be met with power? It's a question that leaders across religious traditions have wrestled with, and the answer often depends on how we view the ultimate purpose of life. As we turn to the Dalai Lama, we see a focus on compassion as the central pillar of his philosophy. For him, compassion isn't just a feeling, it's an action, a commitment to the well-being of others, regardless of whether they share your beliefs, your race, or your nationality. The Dalai Lama teaches that the path to peace begins with empathy, with understanding the suffering of others as our own. His philosophy challenges us to rethink how we approach conflict, urging us to see beyond our immediate frustrations or enemies and consider the long-term impact of our actions on the global community. But here's where it gets complicated. Can we really practice this kind of compassion in a world driven by competition, material gain, and self-interest? The Dalai Lama's teachings ask us to slow down and reflect on how we live, on whether we are contributing to the problem or part of the solution. He shows that true leadership isn't just about having power, it's about using that power to serve others and foster peace. In modern times, leaders like Joel Osteen and Rick Warren have adapted religious philosophy for a different audience. Their teachings focus more on personal empowerment, finding purpose, and living a life of abundance. For them, faith is not just about salvation in the next life, but about thriving in this one. Their messages resonate with people searching for meaning in an increasingly complex and chaotic world. But we have to ask, does this focus on personal success and empowerment align with the deeper, more sacrificial philosophies of earlier religious leaders? Or is it a reflection of the way our modern society has reinterpreted spiritual values? The philosophies of religious authors offer us a wide range of perspectives on life, ethics, and the human condition. They challenge us to think beyond the material world and confront the deeper questions of existence. How do we respond to suffering? What is the nature of good and evil? How should we treat others? These are not abstract questions. They are the foundation of how we live our lives and shape the societies we build. We've explored how the foundational philosophies of religious leaders address the core of human existence. Now let's dig deeper into how these philosophies have driven social transformation and reshaped societies over centuries. These philosophies are not just spiritual or intellectual exercises. They've been the driving force behind revolutions, movements, and the reimagining of justice, community, and even governance. Take the teachings of Confucius as a prime example. His philosophy wasn't just about individual morality, but about how society should be organized. Confucius taught that a well-ordered society is built on the foundation of proper relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife. These relationships were bound by a sense of duty and mutual respect, The ruler, for instance, was expected to act with virtue and benevolence, and in return, the subjects would offer loyalty and obedience. Confucian philosophy laid the groundwork for thousands of years of governance in China and influenced cultures across East Asia. It framed how leadership should function not through fear or domination, but through moral example. But here's the key question Confucius makes us ask. Can a society truly flourish when everything depends on the moral integrity of its leaders? What happens when leaders fail to live up to these ideals? History has shown that the Confucian model works well when rulers are virtuous, but it also reveals the potential for collapse when those in power become corrupt or self-serving. This reliance on personal virtue to maintain social order introduces fragility into the system, leaving society vulnerable to chaos in the absence of good leadership. We see a similar challenge in Western religious philosophy, particularly in the Christian tradition, where leaders like St. Augustine grappled with the tension between human imperfection and divine justice. Augustine's philosophy centered around the idea that humanity, in its fallen state, is inherently flawed, and that true justice and peace can only be achieved through divine grace. Augustine's city of God contrasts the earthly city, driven by human desires and sin, with the heavenly city, where God's will reigns supreme. He wasn't just talking about an afterlife. Augustine was laying the philosophical groundwork for how Christians should view the world around them. Earthly systems, no matter how well constructed, would always be flawed because they are run by flawed human beings. Augustine's philosophy leads to a profound reflection on power and governance. If humans are inherently flawed, how do we create just systems in an unjust world? Should we strive to make our earthly societies more like the city of God? Or do we accept that true justice will only come in the next life? His writings had a massive impact on how later Christian thinkers approached politics and morality, influencing everything from medieval governance to modern political philosophy. Fast forward to more contemporary leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., whose philosophy was shaped by both his Christian faith and his understanding of social justice. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, deeply rooted in the teachings of Jesus, wasn't just about civil rights. It was about transforming the moral fabric of society. King believed that injustice anywhere was a threat to justice everywhere, and that by confronting systems of oppression with love and nonviolence, the moral conscience of the oppressor could be awakened. His vision was not just to dismantle segregation, but to create a beloved community where all people, regardless of race, live in harmony and equality. King's teachings present us with a practical and philosophical challenge. Can love and nonviolence truly overcome entrenched systems of oppression? History shows us moments where it did, such as the civil rights movement, but it also raises the question of how long such movements can endure in the face of violent opposition. King's philosophy pushes us to consider the long game, the idea that true social transformation requires not just political change, but a change of heart, a moral revolution. Gandhi, too, sought social transformation through nonviolence, but his approach was shaped by Hindu principles like ahimsa, nonviolence, and satyagraha, truth force. For Gandhi, nonviolence wasn't just a tactic, it was a way of life. He believed that by holding steadfast to truth and refusing to meet violence with violence, both the individual and society could be transformed. Gandhi's philosophy was tested through decades of struggle against British colonial rule, and his success in achieving India's independence without a violent uprising remains one of the most remarkable political achievements of the 20th century. Yet Gandhi's philosophy also raises difficult questions. Can nonviolence work in every situation? What about when faced with a regime that refuses to acknowledge peaceful protests, or when violence is so deeply entrenched in a society that nonviolence seems ineffective? So these questions continue to resonate today in movements for social justice around the world, where activists must decide whether to adopt the methods of King and Gandhi or to take more aggressive stances against systems of oppression. On the other side of the spectrum, leaders like Malcolm X argued that nonviolence wasn't always the answer, especially when it came to systemic racism. Malcolm X's early philosophy was shaped by the Nation of Islam, which emphasized self-reliance, black empowerment, and when necessary, self-defense. His message spoke to African Americans who felt that peaceful protests were too slow and too conciliatory in the face of violent racism. For Malcolm, the fight for justice required strength and a willingness to defend oneself, even if that meant using force. Malcolm X's later life shows an evolution in his thinking, particularly after his pilgrimage to Mecca, where he encountered Muslims of all races and began to advocate for a more inclusive form of resistance. Still, his philosophy challenges us to think about what justice requires. Is it enough to wait patiently for systems of oppression to change through peaceful protest, or is there a point where more forceful action is justified? Malcolm X pushed us to ask whether oppressed communities have the right to defend themselves by any means necessary when their humanity is denied. The philosophies of these leaders reveal a tension between two powerful ideas, the ideal of nonviolence and the reality of violence in the world. These ideas are not just historical, they're living questions in today's world. When we look at modern conflicts, whether in political protests or in movements for racial justice, we see echoes of these philosophical debates. How do we resist injustice? Is it possible to achieve lasting social transformation without resorting to violence? Or is violence sometimes necessary to dismantle deeply ingrained systems of power? Religious leaders have also influenced how societies think about ethics and morality on a fundamental level. The Dalai Lama, for instance, teaches that compassion and empathy should be the guiding principles of human interaction. He encourages us to recognize the shared humanity in every person and to approach conflict not with aggression but with understanding. His philosophy is deeply grounded in Buddhist teachings, which emphasize the interconnectedness of all beings. But can such compassion extend to those who do harm? Can we truly practice compassion in a world that often seems to reward selfishness and aggression? These questions aren't just theoretical, they have real implications for how we live and govern our societies. Compassion is easy when dealing with friends or allies, but what about when dealing with enemies? The Dalai Lama challenges us to broaden our sense of empathy, to see even those who oppose us as part of the same human family. Joel Osteen and Rick Warren, modern Christian leaders, have taken a different philosophical approach. Their messages focus more on personal empowerment, self-help, and the idea that faith can lead to a successful, fulfilled life here and now. Osteen's philosophy of positive thinking resonates with millions of people who are searching for meaning and success in their personal lives. He teaches that by believing in oneself and maintaining faith, people can achieve their dreams. Rick Warren's purpose-driven life similarly encourages believers to find their purpose through faith and live out that purpose in practical ways. But there's a philosophical tension here as well. Is this focus on personal success and happiness consistent with the more self-sacrificial messages of early religious leaders? Or is it a reflection of how modern culture has reinterpreted faith? These philosophies, whether they advocate for compassion, nonviolence, empowerment, or self-defense, all ask us to reflect on the kind of world we want to build. They ask us to consider how we relate to others, how we seek justice, and what it means to live a meaningful life. The philosophies of religious continue to shape our societies, our politics, and our lives in profound ways. We begin to see how the philosophies of religious leaders, though often centuries old, continue to have an undeniable impact on the modern society operates and the way we, as individuals, navigate moral and ethical dilemmas. These philosophies aren't relics of the past. Instead, they are living frameworks that guide everything from how we structure our laws to how we understand justice, compassion, and personal fulfillment. Let's start by examining how religious philosophies have shaped modern legal and political systems. The concept of justice, as we understand it today, owes much to religious teachings. For instance, the influence of Judeo-Christian ethics is evident in many legal systems around the world. Laws about fairness, the dignity of human life, and individual rights are deeply intertwined with biblical teachings. The idea that all people are created equal, as found in Christianity, has shaped the development of human rights and democratic systems. Consider how Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of justice, grounded in Christian principles, played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. King's vision wasn't just about changing laws, it was about transforming the moral consciousness of a nation. He understood that the fight for racial equality was as much a spiritual battle as it was a political one. King famously declared that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, a belief rooted in his faith that justice would ultimately prevail because it was aligned with divine truth. King's philosophy challenges modern society to think about justice not just in terms of legal systems, but in terms of moral obligation. Are laws enough to ensure justice, or do we need a deeper, more personal commitment to equality and fairness? His legacy shows us that while laws can change society, true justice requires individuals to confront their own biases and prejudices. Another example of religious philosophy's impact on modern governance comes from the teachings of Confucius, whose ideas about ethical leadership and social harmony have left an indelible mark on East Asian political systems. Confucian philosophy emphasizes the importance of moral character in leadership, arguing that a ruler's virtue is essential to maintaining order and harmony within society. This belief in the moral responsibility of leaders continues to influence political thought in China, Korea, and Japan, where Confucian values are often invoked in discussions about governance and ethics. In many ways, Confucius's philosophy runs counter to the more legalistic, rule-based systems that dominate Western political thought. Whereas Western systems tend to emphasize the importance of laws and institutions in maintaining order, Confucius believed that personal virtue and moral leadership were the keys to a just society. This difference raises important questions about how we think about governance today. Is it more important to have strict laws or to have leaders who embody ethical principles? Can a society function well if its leaders lack moral integrity, even if its laws are just? As we look at these contrasting approaches, we see how the philosophies of religious leaders shape not just the rules of society, but its underlying values. These values influence how we understand freedom, justice, and responsibility. And this brings us to one of the most significant philosophical tensions in modern society, the relationship between individual freedom and collective responsibility. Religious leaders have often wrestled with this tension. Jesus Christ, for example, emphasized personal transformation and moral responsibility, but his teachings also called for a radical form of community. His command to love your neighbor as yourself wasn't just a call for individual kindness, it was a challenge to build communities rooted in mutual care and concern. This idea of collective responsibility is echoed in many religious traditions, from Islam's emphasis on charity and social justice to Buddhism's teachings on interdependence and compassion. But modern society often prioritizes individual freedom above all else. We live in a world that celebrates personal achievement and self-reliance, sometimes at the expense of community and shared responsibility. The philosophies of religious leaders challenge this view by reminding us that individual flourishing is often tied to the well-being of others. They ask us to reconsider what it means to be truly free. Are we free when we focus only on ourselves, or is true freedom found in our ability to contribute to the greater good? This question is especially relevant when we look at modern economic systems, which are often driven by competition and individual gain. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi offer a stark contrast to this worldview. Gandhi's philosophy of Sarvodaya, the welfare of all, was rooted in the belief that true progress comes not from the accumulation of wealth, but from the upliftment of every individual, particularly the poorest and most vulnerable. His emphasis on simplicity, self-sufficiency, and non-possession was a direct challenge to the materialism and consumerism that dominate modern economies. Gandhi's ideas push us to think critically about how we define success and progress. Are we truly progressing as a society if economic growth comes at the expense of environmental degradation or the exploitation of the poor? Gandhi's life and philosophy force us to confront the ethical implications of our economic choices. In a world where resources are limited and inequality is growing, his teachings on simplicity and social responsibility are more relevant than ever. The philosophies of religious leaders also continue to shape debates about morality and ethics in more personal realms, such as how we approach issues like forgiveness, suffering, and death. The problem of suffering in particular has been a central concern for religious thinkers across all traditions. How do we make sense of suffering in a world that, for many, is governed by a benevolent God? Why do bad things happen to good people? For centuries, religious leaders have offered different answers to these questions. In Christianity, suffering is often seen as a test of faith or as a means of drawing closer to God. In Buddhism, suffering is understood as an inherent part of life, but one that can be transcended through the practice of mindfulness and compassion. The Dalai Lama teaches that suffering is an opportunity to cultivate empathy for others and to develop a deeper sense of connection to the world. These teachings challenge the way we think about suffering in modern society. In a world that prioritizes comfort, pleasure, and the avoidance of pain, religious philosophies remind us that suffering can have meaning. It can be a path to growth, a way to deepen our understanding of life and our relationships with others. But at the same time, these teachings also ask us to confront the reality of suffering in our world today, whether in the form of poverty, war, or inequality, and to consider what we are called to do in response. This brings us back to the core message of many religious leaders, the call to act. Whether it's Jesus' command to love our enemies, Gandhi's insistence on nonviolence, or the Dalai Lama's appeal for compassion, these philosophies are not just about personal contemplation, they are about how we live in the world. They challenge us to take our beliefs and turn them into action, to live in a way that reflects the values we hold dear. In today's world, the philosophies of religious leaders continue to guide us as we navigate the complex ethical and moral challenges of modern life. From debates about climate change and economic inequality to questions of justice and human rights, these ancient teachings offer timeless wisdom. They remind us that, at the heart of every decision, every action, and every relationship, there is a question of how we treat others and how we understand our place in the world. As we wrap up this exploration, let's reflect on the key lessons we've uncovered. Religious philosophies are not just about the past. They are living frameworks that help us make sense of the present and guide us toward a more just and compassionate future. They remind us that the answers to life's deepest questions are not found in isolation, but in how we engage with each other and the world around us. The enduring influence of these philosophies shows that while the world may change, the questions of meaning, purpose, and morality remain constant. And as long as those questions persist, the wisdom of religious leaders will continue to offer guidance, inspiration, and hope.